Grace Taylor pulled the collar of her light gray cardigan higher as she walked slowly toward the majestic glass building of the Stanford University Department of Mathematics. Her dark brown hair was neatly tied back, her face bare of makeup, and her worn-out flats made soft, careful steps on the cobblestone path leading into a world she had always thought was meant for someone else. If you believe that a person's true worth lies not in appearance or status, but in perseverance and relentless passion, then please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing inspiring stories like this with more people around the world. Now, let's return to the story, where many surprises are still waiting for you. At 32, she looked nothing like the lively young students bustling around her in Stanford hoodies and AirPods, laughing excitedly about prestigious scholarships or upcoming summer internships at world-renowned institutes. She was merely a contract accountant at a small law firm in Columbus, Ohio. No degree, no accolades, only a quiet, persistent love for numbers. Grace stopped in front of the digital bulletin board displaying the class schedule and quietly double-checked. The room she had printed out at home, Room 4B, Advanced Theoretical Calculus, Instructor, Professor Lorraine Whitaker. Just the name alone was enough to make someone swallow hard. The 800-page textbook by Professor Whitaker still sat beside Grace's bed every night, covered in notes and highlights. The automatic glass doors opened, revealing a hallway paneled in gleaming oak. Grace stepped in, her chest tightening. None of the students nearby paid her any attention, and that was just how she preferred it. She knew she didn't fit in, and that made every glance she might face in the classroom ahead all the more terrifying. When she entered the lecture hall, the atmosphere dipped slightly. She chose a seat near the front, taking out her thick notebook, carefully wrapped in a brown paper cover, along with a few sharpened pencils. A male student in a cashmere sweater sitting beside her subtly leaned away, as though her simplicity were contagious. "Is this seat taken?" Grace asked softly. "No," he replied curtly, eyes fixed on his tablet screen. Grace wasn't surprised. She had grown used to how people reacted when someone like her stepped into places clearly not meant for her. Behind her, a few whispers began to rise. Is she part of some trial program? No degree. Learned math online. Probably. Thinks she's special. She pretended not to hear, eyes locked on the blank first page of her notebook. The large chalkboard at the front was framed by portraits of brilliant mathematicians, nearly all of them men, their solemn gazes seeming to warn that only the truly worthy had a place here. The side door swung open. The entire class fell. Silent. Professor Lorraine Whitaker entered like a gust of cold wind. Her hair was pinned in a tight bun, her black suit immaculate, and her piercing eyes swept across the rows like an X-ray beam. Walking a few steps behind was a gentler figure, Professor Michelle Grant, the one who had called Grace a few weeks ago, the only person who had believed in the math proofs Grace had sent via email. Professor Whitaker's gaze landed on Grace in the space of a single breath, and her lips curled slightly, as if she had just found the subject of today's trial by fire. "Welcome to Advanced Theoretical Calculus," she said, with a voice that was clear, deliberate, and as cold as metal. "This course will stretch your mathematical thinking to its limits. For those who lack the proper foundation," she stared directly at Grace, "the last day to withdraw is Friday." A warning with no subtlety. Grace sat up straighter. She had known this day would come, and she would not back down. She hadn't come here to be welcomed. She came to prove that true understanding required neither medals nor diplomas. A bell rang to signal the beginning of class, and the doors to the unforgiving world of mathematics officially opened. Grace was quickly swept up by the lecture, despite the wary glances cast at her by the surrounding students. Professor Whitaker stood at the board, drawing mathematical symbols with the speed and precision of someone who had taught this material her entire life. She spoke of higher-order differentials, partial differential systems, and multidimensional space transformations as if narrating a story. For many in the room, it was a foreign language. But for Grace, Every line of chalk felt like lines. Of logical poetry she had adored in silence, night after night, long after the city had gone to sleep. She took meticulous notes, missing not a single mark. From time to time, her eyes would brighten when she spotted a connection, a shorter path, an alternative method. But she kept her thoughts to herself. In this world, silence was her first suit of armor. And then, the moment she dreaded most, arrived. "Ms. Taylor," Professor Whitaker's voice rang out, cold as marble. "I see you're quite attentive. Perhaps you wouldn't mind explaining to us the approach to the following problem." The lecture hall fell completely silent. Grace lifted her head, meeting the professor's steely gaze. On the board was a complex expression, a differential equation with nested variables and irregular boundary conditions. She recognized it. A variant of the problem from Chapter 7 of Whitaker's own textbook, one she had spent an entire week solving, finding a more elegant solution than the one outlined in the book. Grace hesitated. "No need to worry," Professor Whitaker cut in. "If this is beyond your abilities, we'll understand." A wave of whispers rippled through the room. A student in the back chuckled softly. "Get ready for a train wreck," someone murmured. Grace drew a deep breath, closed her notebook, and stood. She didn't know how her legs managed to carry her toward the board, but her hand, the same hand that once trembled when she signed her first apartment lease, now held the chalk with a surprising steadiness. She scanned the problem once more. Slowly, familiar structures began to reveal themselves beneath the tangled symbols. She wrote the first step, standard, expected, to set the direction. Then, at step 3, she paused. From deep in her memory, an alternative method she had tested began to surface. She changed variables, a substitution few would choose, and the nested expressions began to unfold and simplify. The class started to notice. No one spoke, but the energy shifted. Gone were the looks of disdain, replaced by curiosity. Then awe. Professor Grant leaned slightly forward, her eyes lighting up as she followed Grace's every move. Step by step, the solution came to life. Not only correct, but beautiful. Concise, coherent, and satisfying, like watching a perfectly choreographed dance. When Grace wrote the final line and placed the chalk down on the tray, she didn't turn around immediately. She needed a breath. Then she turned. The faces that had been indifferent only moments ago were now quiet, tense. Professor Whitaker approached the board, her eyes scanning each line. She said nothing as she checked every step, every transition. The deeper she read, the more her brow furrowed, not from errors, there were none, but because what she was seeing defied her expectations. Entirely, this method. Professor Grant spoke first, her eyes still fixed on the board. "It bypasses the Peterson approach entirely." Grace nodded. "I found a link to Carrar's optimization framework. If you apply a modified hyperbolic substitution at step 2, the nested integrals simplify automatically." A student in the front row sat up straighter. That's not in the textbook," he whispered, half in shock, half in admiration. "No," Grace replied quietly. "I discovered it while solving similar problems at night." Professor Whitaker pressed her lips together. Clearly this wasn't what she had expected. She stepped back from the board, her tone carefully measured. An interesting approach. Unorthodox, certainly. But sometimes creativity does yield unexpected solutions. From someone like her, that was practically a standing ovation. "You may return to your seat," she said, her voice expressionless. Grace nodded and walked quietly back to her chair. The student in the cashmere sweater shifted to the side, giving her more space. A small gesture, but enough to soften something in Grace's chest. In this harsh world, she had taken her very first step, not with appearance, not with excuses, but with true intellect. The lecture hall fell into a strange silence as Grace returned to her seat. There were no more whispers, no more mocking laughter. The heavy atmosphere of judgment had shifted into something else. confusion, astonishment, and more than a few. Students now stole glances at her, as if trying to reassess someone they had just misjudged. But Professor Whitaker didn't seem willing to let the class end with her authority quietly usurped. She turned back to the board, her gaze as sharp as a razor's edge. "Before we conclude today," she said, her voice steady and detached, "I'd like to introduce another problem, one that reflects the danger of relying too heavily on unchecked intuition." Then she began to write. Firm white strokes built a massive equation, longer and far more complex than the first. A multi-dimensional integral, laced with abnormal boundary conditions. Grace squinted, trying to follow as the problem unfolded like an imposing wall. "Would anyone like to try?" the professor asked, her eyes scanning the room, then landing exactly where they were meant to. On Grace. Perhaps Miss Taylor would like another opportunity to demonstrate her abilities. The tone was sweet in a dangerous way. A trap laid bare. Grace said nothing. She knew that if she declined, she would confirm that her earlier solution had been nothing more than a stroke of luck. But if she accepted, she'd be walking into an uneven duel, a problem not just difficult, but seemingly designed to break her in front of everyone. "I'll give it a try," Grace said, rising to her feet. The air seemed to freeze. The student in the cashmere sweater turned toward her, no longer cold, but expectant. "Good luck," he whispered, his voice now devoid of scorn. Grace took the piece of chalk from Professor Whitaker's hand. Her palm was cold as metal, her gaze openly anticipating Grace's failure. She turned to face the board. This problem wasn't anything like the ones she had seen in books. Its structure was strange, and the way the variables were arranged seemed deliberately crafted to mislead. Grace began forming a mental map. She tried substituting variables, separating integrals, but every path led to a dead end. The murmurs behind her began to stir again. Then she paused. Like a single off note in a melody, she sensed something was wrong, or rather something was hidden, a symmetry. It was subtle, but when seen as a whole, it was there, an invisible axis dividing the equation into two mirrored halves. The symmetry wasn't in the expressions themselves, but in the relationship between the boundary conditions. Grace rotated the chalk and began rewriting the problem in a new coordinate system. The chaos began to fall into place. She was no longer scrambling. Instead, each step was clear, deliberate. The room grew so still it was as if no one dared to breathe. When the final line was complete, she boxed the solution and placed the chalk in the tray, the way a violinist gently rests the bow into its velvet case. Then she turned. "This time, no," one laughed. The entire hall sat in silence, holding its breath. Professor Whitaker stepped forward. She read through each line, eyes narrowing, then widening at the moment of the coordinate transformation, the exact place where every classical method would have collapsed, but Grace's solution had opened up. "You've applied a hidden Jacobian transformation," came a voice from behind. It was Professor Grant. She stepped forward, her eyes bright with admiration. "The way you spotted that, it's brilliant." Professor Whitaker said nothing at first. Her face remained still, but her lips were tightly pressed together as if she were swallowing something bitter and hard. "A creative method," she said slowly, "though it may be difficult to generalize for more complex problems. That was all. A reluctant acknowledgement, but from the woman known as the iron wall of theoretical mathematics, it was as weighty as thunder." Grace gave a small nod and returned quietly to her seat. This time, the whispers that followed were different. What did she just do? She changed the coordinate system? Who even thinks like that? I have to ask her next time. A light touch on her shoulder. The same student who had once leaned away now said softly, "The way you transformed that problem, I've never seen anything like it. Could you explain it after class?" Grace smiled. She had never imagined the day would come when someone would ask her that, and she nodded. From the corner of the room, Professor Grant was watching her, her gaze warm and openly proud. The class had ended, but the atmosphere lingered in the air like a soft echo. Unlike all the other days when Grace quietly packed her things and slipped out unnoticed, today she was surrounded by a group of students. Those who had once looked past her now leaned in with curiosity, asking questions about the transformation she had just performed. Their questions no longer carried doubt, only genuine respect. How did you spot that hidden axis of symmetry? Where? Did you learn Jacobian transformations? I've only heard the term. Did you use any math software, or was that all by hand? Grace wasn't good at conversation. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to be asked. She no longer felt like an outsider trying to squeeze into a world that wasn't hers. She was being listened to. Not for her appearance, not for credentials, but for her understanding. I just did so many problems like this that I started seeing familiar patterns. I didn't go through formal training, so I never really knew what was considered right or wrong. I just picked the faster path. Her words were simple, but to those around her, they carried a quiet weight. The difference didn't lie in titles. It lay in the ability to see through to the heart of the problem. A few minutes later, Professor Michelle Grant approached, her expression gentle and warm. Grace, you mind stopping by my office for a bit? There's something I'd like to discuss. Grace nodded and followed her out of the lecture hall. The two walked down the polished wood hallway, autumn light filtering through the tall windows, casting slow-motion shadows on the floor like frames from an old film. Professor Grant's office was on the third floor, next to the graduate research wing. Unlike Whitaker's cold and austere style, her office was bright, decorated with abstract paintings and lined with small green plants perched on window ledges. "Please, have a seat," she said, pulling out the chair opposite her desk. As Grace settled in, Professor Grant opened a drawer and placed a slim folder on the table. "Grace, I want to talk about your status in the program. At the moment, you're an auditing participant. No official student ID, no course credits, and no access to advanced research resources." Grace nodded. A faint pang of disappointment stirred inside her. She had once believed that simply sitting in the classroom was enough. But after today's lesson, she knew she wanted more. Not prestige, but a real chance to keep walking this path of thought. "After what I've witnessed today," Professor Grant continued, her tone calm but firm, "I believe that's no longer a suitable arrangement for someone of your capability." She slid the folder toward Grace. "This is a formal recommendation to place you under a special research scholarship. The condition is that you submit a summary of your method for solving today's problem and your self-study notes. I'd like to present it to the department board." Grace sat still for a few seconds, her hand resting on the folder, letting the reality settle in. Years of quietly studying math in her small Ohio apartment, countless sleepless nights spent wrestling with problems no one else knew about. Now, someone had seen it. "I accept," she said softly, but with quiet resolve. "There's one more thing," Professor Grant added, her eyes searching. "I think your alternative method deserves to be presented at the department's internal symposium next month. It's worthy of higher-level discussion." Grace smiled, not for the spotlight, but because for the first time in her life she could contribute to the world of knowledge she had admired from afar. As they stepped out of the office together, the hallway had thinned, but something in the air had shifted. A few students passed by, this time offering friendly nods, polite greetings, even a few smiles. One male student with a backpack paused awkwardly before speaking up. "Will you be joining the Thursday study group? We meet in the Math Commons. If you have time, we'd love to have you." Before she could respond, he nodded quickly, almost reassuring himself. "It's just that the way you looked at the problem was so different. We'd like to learn from that." "I'll think about it," Grace replied, slightly unsure. She wasn't used to being invited in. As she walked out of the building, Grace's phone buzzed. A message from a colleague at the law office. "How's the math thing?" "Going? Do those geniuses even speak human?" Grace smiled. She turned to glance back at the building, the one she had entered in the morning as an outsider, and now was leaving as part of its living breath. She replied, "Pretty good. Actually, I might be getting a research scholarship." Message. Sent. She slipped the phone into her pocket and kept walking, her heart light, as though she had finally set down the weight of a lifetime of quiet doubt. Grace returned to Stanford the next morning with a completely different spirit. No longer were her steps hesitant. No longer did she shrink beneath the fiery red autumn leaves lining the brick walkways. Instead, there was a quiet steadiness in her stride, as if she had taken root in this soil of knowledge. She entered the mathematics building with her hair neatly tied back, a crisp plaid shirt tucked beneath a thin cardigan, still simple as ever, but her eyes had changed. Those who had once passed her without notice now nodded in greeting. A student from the calculus class caught up beside her and asked eagerly, "Ms. Taylor, about that solution yesterday. We're still a bit lost on the coordinate transformation. Would you be willing to walk us through it at the study group tomorrow night?" Grace nodded, smiling. For the first time in her life, the knowledge she had cultivated in silence had become a bridge, not to prove her worth, but to share it. She spent the entire morning working in the math department library, typing up a manuscript of her solution on an old laptop. No embellishment, no flair, just a clear, honest presentation of what she had quietly done in the shadows. When she submitted the summary to Professor Grant, the professor gave a small nod, her smile filled with satisfaction. "You might want to brace yourself," she said. "After the symposium, there will be people who want to work with you." Grace chuckled softly. "I just want to keep learning." "And you will," Professor Grant replied. "But you'll also teach. Whether you realize it or not, students are already beginning to seek you out. They need a new way of seeing, and you are that way." Later that day, Grace walked across the main quad, passing groups of students reading on the grass or deep in discussion about mathematical topics, using terms she had once only heard through the barrier of a screen. This time she didn't feel like an outsider. She stopped before the statue of mathematician David Hilbert, the golden light of dusk casting a warm bronze glow across his stern features. There was something in that light that pulled her back to all those long nights in Ohio, when it had been just her, a desk lamp, and lines of equations scribbled onto old paper, smudged with ink and cooled coffee. Back then, she never imagined anyone would listen. She didn't study math to become someone. She studied because not studying left her feeling incomplete. The way others needed music or language, she needed logic, numbers, the satisfaction of completeness. Footsteps echoed softly behind her. When she turned, it was Professor Lorraine Whitaker, still in her sharp black suit, eyes still precise as blades. But this time, her expression held none of its usual tension. "Ms. Taylor," she said, her voice as even as ever. "Professor," Grace replied calmly, meeting her gaze. "Regarding yesterday's solution, I reviewed it again in my office," she said without preamble. "The transformation you applied in step 4, unconventional, but more optimal than the classical route." Grace nodded but said nothing. "I rarely encounter students, or scholars, with mathematical intuition that sharp," she continued, her tone now carrying something new. Recognition. Not warmth, but a kind of respect shared only by those who had earned it through fire. "I won't apologize for testing you," she added after a pause, "but I will acknowledge this. You belong here." It wasn't praise, but from Lorraine Whitaker, it was a coronation. "Thank you, Professor," Grace said, her voice soft as breath. Whitaker nodded and walked away, leaving Grace standing in the center of the courtyard, wrapped in the glow of a setting sun. As she left the math building, Her phone buzzed softly. An email from the academic board. Her application to convert into a research scholar had been approved, along with an invitation to speak at the upcoming departmental symposium. She reread it once, then folded the phone shut and slipped it into her pocket. As she passed a group of students animatedly debating a nonlinear equation, someone called out, "Grace, do you have a minute? We're stuck on this part about nonlinear systems." She turned and stepped toward them, knowing, for the first time in her life, exactly where she belonged. We've now come to the end of a journey full of quiet power and emotional resonance. A story may close, but its echoes remain with each of us. If Grace Taylor's story touched you, inspired you, or made you reflect in any way, don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll continue sharing stories like this, quiet, profound, and sometimes able to change the way you see the world. Thank you for walking this path with us.